Hi, I'm Alex Twinspark and welcome back to Twinspark Reviews. I'm aware it's been a couple of weeks. Now, you might remember last time that we had a 1.6 diesel red hatchback, which wasn't meant to be what I was recording because I was meant to do my MR2, which currently has no exhaust. So I thought, after having said 1.6 red diesel hatchback last week, I'd go for something much different. So what I've gone for is a 1.6 diesel hatchback. But it's in blue, so it makes all the difference. This is a 2014 Ford Fiesta Titanium, and it looks relatively nice. It's got a lovely blue paint. And I think even though these are very generic, in fact, at one point these were the best selling cars in the UK, period, I think they don't actually look that generic. They've aged relatively well, and I think they're actually quite happy looking cars. This one is equipped with a 1.6 diesel engine, which generates 88 horsepower. But we'll skip over that. Now, with a car that's sold this well and has this particular drivetrain and engine setup, etc., it'd be nice to have an apples to apples comparison. Like this over here, for example. Now, the Polo we reviewed in the last episode is more or less same power, same output, all of that sort of things. But it's nice to see where the differences in the spending in R&D have gone. These are both roughly the same price now. They were both roughly the same price new. However, that over there, more popular than this. So why? Now, one of the things I think has sold it quite well is the looks. I think despite the fact that these are everywhere, these do stick out in quite a nice way, especially in this lovely blue paint. They're clear stealing from Aston Martin in the design front on the front end, I think has worked really, really well. It's also got these lovely ST wheels, which make the ride unbearably harsh, but they do look very, very nice. And despite the fact that these are used by boy racers everywhere, especially in that black and red trim, they look fairly non-threatening, which compared to, say, again, the Polo, this is a nice looking car, but it's a slightly generic looking car, and if it's not for Joe's sort of nice new headlights here, this thing just blends into the background, whereas the Fiesta still has a bit of presence to itself. Now, the other thing as well is practicality. So if we're going to talk about practicality, let's start with the boot. Any avid film fans out there will know we crossed the line of continuity because there's a very spiky bush there, and I felt a bit sorry for Joe. So excuse this very bizarre spin, but the boot. It's got a fairly sizable boot. In fact, this one comes with an inbuilt sandpit, which you don't get in most cars, in fairness. I'm not sure if it's an optional extra or if it's just the fact this was owned by a builder for some time. But however, that does rob a fair bit of space from the rear passengers. They've not got as much legroom as perhaps you'd hope. But that's on the inside. Now, again, talking about the inside-outside, so... Now, unfortunately, my girlfriend is a little bit shorter than I am, so that's a bit better. Now, in here, compared to the Polo, it, on the surface at least, looks a lot nicer. The materials certainly don't seem as cheap and scratchy. But there's the thing they do in the opposite to the Polo, where the Polo puts all the nice materials in where you're touching it. Whereas here, all the things you look at look lovely, but things like these dials here feel nasty and cheap and a bit chintzy. I don't like this dial here at all. And things like this hazard button, way too small and not very ergonomic. But on the whole, it actually looks a lot more expensive in here than it maybe actually is. Now, in regards to the interior looking quite nice, I can see why that maybe has its appeal and it sells so well to a lot of people, because it does look, at least, like a quality product in here. I will say the build quality, not very good, especially compared to the Polo. Bear in mind these cars have existed, you know, for the same amount of time. They were sold for roughly the same money new. While the Polo looks a lot cheaper inside, it has at least maintained that quality its whole life. This, despite being much lower miles, is starting to melt. You'll see here we've got the glue coming from this mirror holder melting and dripping down the windscreen. You know, there's plenty of bits of trim that are a little bit more shaky. This here, center console, not held in particularly well. This car has been abused, but not amazingly hard, and the fact that it's in this condition already isn't a good sign. I will say, for a high trim, it's not amazingly well equipped. The rear windows, for example, they wind up. The Polo over there has full electric and I believe fully auto windows all four corners. This only has them on the front. It doesn't even bother with the back. You know, this stereo here, which by the way, you can't remove with very much ease. In fact, I have a few mechanic friends that tell me in order to replace these, it's a dash out job. This is the good radio. If you get the slightly cheaper one with the crap radio, you're kind of stuck with it. And even at that, the buttons on it are horrible. This feels very, very cheap, this radio. It feels a lot like when you go to, say, IKEA or Asda, and you buy a radio from there. Not your lovely Blaupunk systems with it's all, you know, look at this lovely wood speaker, etc. It's just, oh, it's a radio. You'll have it for 10 years and then you'll throw it out because it's full of dust. It's not bad per se, but it's nothing amazing. In terms of interior space as well, in the front, very, very spacious and happy, whereas the back, again, not particularly big, especially compared to the Polo. The Polo clearly has prioritised its rear passengers. In here, we prioritise boot space. That's not a problem if you don't have many friends, so for myself, it would be great. However, for other people who have maybe families or have you, consider maybe getting the Focus or the Polo instead. Now, much like the Polo before, I believe, you know, this being a diesel hatchback, the two places this is going to shine is the motorway and the back roads because, well, it's a diesel, so it'll do well on the motorway, and it's a hatchback, so it should be fun on the back roads. So, let's go find out how it reacts in those areas. So, on the motorway, compared to, you know, for example, the Polo, there is not much grunt at all. It's weird, it's got about 200 newton meters, which you'd think, oh, that's enough to be punchy, but I mean, this is foot down in 5th, which okay, right, I'm in 5th, but still, very, very slow to accelerate. It's also very loud in here. I'm aware Abbey has recently changed the rear tyres, so that might explain that a bit, but at the same time, it shouldn't be this loud. It doesn't feel nearly as refined as the Polo does. In fact, the Polo arguably is a lot more solid a vehicle and a lot more refined a vehicle. It's not amazingly spacious. I felt like I had a lot more room in the Polo. I feel a little bit more cramped in here, which doesn't make a lot of sense because I'm fairly sure on paper this is a slightly larger car. It's very bizarre that it does feel so tight. To be honest, I'm actually thinking right now, I'm not sure how comfortable this would be on a long distance. I know Abby used this to do long distances, you know, she drives them 2 hours to come and see me, for example. But I don't know if I'd be able to sit in these particularly long because they are bucketed. But I'm not sure if they're bucketed enough to actually support you, as you'll find out later on the back roads. But they are bucketed enough that they feel just a little bit intrusive as you're driving, which I'm not actually sure I like. One thing I will say though is the aircon in this is tremendous, and it's not very loud either. We were pleasantly cool while filming this, with it on like the lowest setting. So in regards to things like that, I can definitely see why maybe it sells so well. I mean, this car wasn't particularly expensive new, and it's definitely not very expensive now. I believe when these were new, I think you could get this one for around 20 grand or less, which even adjusted for inflation still isn't particularly much. And obviously I've got good aircon, I have enough power to do the speed limit. This isn't abysmal. So in terms of why people would buy this, I can understand it. If you're not someone who particularly cares about cars, and you wouldn't notice the extra road noise, as it is very noticeably loud in here. If you wouldn't notice the extra road noise because you aren't that way inclined, and you don't particularly care for the big power, and you're happy to sit at 60 miles an hour in the inside lane when you go on the motorway. I get why this is appealing. I understand why you buy it. So, if that's just like on the motorway, I'm not amazingly impressed. Will it set me on fire on the back roads? Let's find out. Now, what I will say is I do actually quite like how responsive the engine is for a diesel. It revs relatively quickly, and the steering itself is actually quite lively. It feels quite connected to the wheels. What I will say, however, is when you start doing that, is you find just how rolly this car is. I mean, I'm having to lean really, really heavily in these corners because it is just rolling straight over. You compare this to the Polo, and the Polo we drove on this exact same road. The Polo felt quite flat and quite planted. This, I am genuinely feeling myself go right across the road. The other thing I'll say as well is when I am going around these corners and I am leaning, I'm finding there's very little support in these seats. Yes, they look bucketed and they should be bucketed, but they aren't holding me in at all. I'm rolling around like this, and that is before I even hit the sides. It's actually quite unsupportive of car. I actually do quite like the sound of this. I got a horrible feeling I'm starting to like diesel engines, which is truly depressing a thought for me. But yeah, this car, the actual chassis itself, I can definitely see why the ST version is so well beloved. I imagine you put a fun little peppy petrol engine in this, and it will be a tremendously fun thing to drive. While I wasn't a huge fan of this on the motorway, I will say a lot of the road noise is, even though we're doing the same speed, I can barely hear it out here on the back roads, and I am actually genuinely enjoying driving it. It's very easy to rev match downshift. It's very, very easy to throw around each corner. I'm having very little difficulty actually getting this to communicate with me along the road. Compare this to the Polo, which was a lot more planted, it felt a lot more secure, and it certainly felt a lot heavier in a lot of ways. This does actually feel quite light and nimble on its feet. I'd say if you have the Polo, you are going to be a lot more comfortable, but in this you're going to be having a lot more fun. While this doesn't really have a great deal of power on the motorway, I do find it's got just enough low-down punch, especially out on the back road back here. And because it isn't particularly refined, such as the Polo is compared, you do hear a lot more of the engine, so you do get to hear that little turbo spooling up, which is quite fun. I do also really love how tight the steering is. I would particularly like to drive one of these again, but with a petrol engine. I feel like that would be a fair bit more fun, especially on a back road like this. The only problem is, I'd imagine they don't have a great deal of torque. This doesn't have much torque either, really. You're talking about 210 newton meters. I actually think possibly even less than that, which, comparative to, say, my MR2, is a lot. But you do feel a lack of power. Low down, great, you got a little bit of grunt, but once you're up to speed, you start to struggle a bit. It starts to wane off. It's when you start addressing the minor details, that's when you start to feel just how cheap it feels in here. Whereas with the VW, all the stuff you actually handle all the time, you know, the steering wheel, the knob controls for the heating and what have you, that feels like a very quality thing. You can tell where Ford have decided to make it look nice, whereas VW put the stuff into making it feel nice. Compared to, say, a Corsa, this is a much more enjoyable drive. Yes, the interior on a Corsa is a lot nicer, and the seats are incredibly comfortable compared. I mean, poor Joe sat next to me is actually in pain now from these chairs. These are actually quite communicative and fun to drive. This is very hatchback in feel, which I'm aware is a very abstract sentence to say, but when you hear all the journalists and all the online car reviews, all of them go, oh yes, you get to drive a hatchback and it's short and it's choppy and this feels like that stereotype. Even with a diesel engine, I feel like I'm having a fair bit of fun chucking it about, and I'm not even going above the speed limit. It feels like fun below the speed limit, and I think that's something that is important and something we miss a lot in especially a lot of modern hot hatches. It's also got a very tight turning circle, which is something I miss because most of my cars don't have that. For example, the mini roundabout I just took, if I did that in my old Alfa, which is an equivalent size car, I'd have to do a 3-point turn. All of this being said, do I like it? Will I want one? Well, so, which of these two 1.6 hatchbacks would I recommend? Well, the Fiesta is certainly a lot more fun to drive. It's a lot more light, a lot more communicative, and this is certainly feeling a lot more solid. This feels like a much more refined quality product. So I'd buy the Volkswagen, which truly confuses me because it's diesel and a Volkswagen, two things I genuinely hate, but the seats in this are so incredibly uncomfortable. At the beginning of the day, I thought, lovely, fine. As we've gone on, it's actually put Joe, the cameraman, in pain. It's been injured by seats. That's not a good sign for your car. It's also incredibly loud. Going along the motorway in this, you could hear the tyres. I've never had a car I can hear the tyres on before. Whereas this is quiet, sublime, and refined. Which is odd. I'm recommending the VW. over a Fiesta, a car that I thought I really liked. But that's the one that takes it. That's a very bizarre note to end on. But if you have any cars that you want to submit to me to review as well, in the same sort of manner with the big fancy camera and Joe and me telling you that it's worse than a VW, please let me know on Instagram at Mr. Twinspark. Yes, so if you've enjoyed this, please press the like and subscribe and all that jazz. And thank you very much. I'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks with a Suzuki Swift Sport. See you then. Emotion. I'm very glad you passed the test. Well done you. Oh, I had a break. But yeah, no, I was trying to reverse. I was helping to like reverse Bay Park, and she's missing the space. It comes up like, oh, let me show you how you do it. I jumped in the driver's seat. And I kept missing the space, but like miles. I've got no idea why. I can reverse the truck. The truck's, you know, twice the length of a bloody Corsa. I can reverse that in absolutely no issue whatsoever. But a Corsa, apparently that's way beyond my remit. What's the line from IT Crowd? A fire. At sea parks. How? At sea parks. Ah, yes, motorway testing. This is. Ah. Oh no. That appears to be plenty of traffic. Ah, at least the other way is quiet. 15s or 16s on it with high profile tyres. My old Peugeot, for example, that had 16-inch alloy wheels, but it had a massive sidewall, so it was incredibly comfortable. That thing was great on the motorway. You could sit in that for hours because the seats were really comfortable and supportive. Yes, it had absolutely no power whatsoever, but the tyres were like yay thick, so that you could bounce that off curbs all the time, and it was fine. I smashed that into a curb. No, it's not a curb, a banking at 35 miles an hour. Definitely 35 and nothing more. That would be illegal and dangerous. It absorbed the bump, and it barely moved, like lightly bent the alloy, but not even to a point where like it threw the weight off. It wasn't until they took the tyre off to change it, they're like, oh, well, that's the thing. It didn't even lose air. High profile tyres. I wish people would stop putting low profile tyres on every vehicle, because they actually ruin the car more often than not. These corners, we're doing the same roads we do. Trailer.